I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Mr Peter Bedford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Before I begin, I'd like to draw the House's attention to my register of interests as a serving councillor in Leicestershire. I am grateful for the opportunity to raise the challenges posed by cross-boundary planning applications in this debate. And I'd like to thank Barry Gannon, a parish councillor in Markfield, who has campaigned for some time for changes in this area. Now, my constituency is unique in many ways, but most pertinently to this debate, it's unique because it has 3 district boundaries that straddle the geographic area. I have Blaby District Council, Charnwood Borough Council and Hinckley and Bosworth Borough Council, all of whom generally work constructively alongside each other with Leicestershire County Council. However, one area of tension that unfortunately exists surrounds developments, collaboration from local plans and housing allocations within each of the district's geographic areas. It is clear to me and many of my constituents that some of the councils are purposefully granting applications on the edge of their geographic boundaries that will impact the following borough or district council. And in essence, they're taking all the benefits but taking none of the negatives that happen in place. Now, I brought this debate today not because I'm an IMBY, but because I want to see a more collaborative approach from local planning authorities. As a Conservative MP, I fully support the notion of a property-owning democracy. This is particularly the case for the next generation, who have found it increasingly difficult to get onto the property ladder. However, the free-for-all approach that the current system offers is harming many of my beautiful villages in mid-Leicestershire. How can it be fair that borough, district and parish councils are able to democratically pass local plans, but adjacent boroughs can undermine that by allowing development on the edge of their boundaries? In my constituency of mid-Leicestershire, for example, I have seen many such examples. In Markfield, the challenges posed by cross-boundary planning applications has been raised with me many times by councillors Claire Harris and Deborah Taylor, and local activists like David Hyde, who lobby me regularly on the frustrations of this cross-boundary anomaly. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
Can I commend the Honourable Gentleman for Leicestershire for bringing this forward? And I spoke to him beforehand, Madam Deputy Speaker, and one of the issues that very clearly arises from what the Honourable Gentleman is referring to is the impact upon other adjoining constituencies or council areas. For instance, GPs, education, roads infrastructure and leisure. You can build the houses in this area, but the people over here will be affected. Does he feel, as many of us feel, that there needs to be a coordinated plan, perhaps at a higher level, that brings it all together? So when it comes to making plans for the future, where the houses might be here, the infrastructure has to be spread across all councils.
Thank you, and I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention. He's absolutely right, and I address some of the points that he's just raised, particularly around infrastructure and use of it. Markfield Village sits in the local planning area of Hinckley and Bosworth Borough Council. But under the current framework, Markfield Parish Council and indeed the Borough Council in Hinckley and Bosworth have very little say or influence over such decisions, as they are made in Charnwood Borough, the adjacent borough. It is obvious that these new Markfield residents will be using the services in Hinckley and Bosworth, in Markfield and the surrounding areas, but will actually be seeing very little benefit, because those benefits will go to other villages. And worst of all, these developments are going ahead without a binding or a constructive input from the local parish council or the adjacent borough council. Another such example I've got is in Glenfield, where Steve Walters, who heads the local action group, has raised the issue they have with Glenfield Village, which sits in Blaby District, adjacent to the City Council, where the City Council there has plans to build several hundred homes on the edge of Glenfield Village. But because the village does not sit in the City Council's boundaries, it'll see all the detriment of that development, but has very little input into the actual decision-making process. Indeed, Steve has campaigned for many times against the urban sprawl of the city, against villages such as Glenfield in my constituency, and I know he's working constructively with me and the local councillors to see if we can get some progress on this issue.
Will the Honourable Member give way?
I'll give way.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way. In my constituency of Horsham, we're almost entirely surrounded by other areas who, for one reason or another, their housing target is constrained. They have A&OB, they have national parks, or they're already built up. The result of that is that under duty to cooperate, Horsham has to take a very unfair proportion of housing to service the whole area. Would he agree that the duty to cooperate system needs to be revised to stop freak results happening in constituencies like mine?
Thank you. I absolutely agree with the honourable member. The example he gives in his area, his constituency, I've seen certainly in Leicestershire, and I know, speaking to many honourable members, they've seen similar examples in their constituencies. But where are we heading? Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, we have a government that it seems is steadfast in planning to concrete over our green and pleasant land, especially in rural constituencies like mine. In July, the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government said that she believed the NPPF offers extra stability to local authorities. But is this really the case? The government's approach is to alleviate the pressure on housing in the UK cities and force additional housing on rural areas without providing the sufficient support for these communities that they will impact. This was seen incredibly by the government's plans to reduce housing targets for cities by 35% in the NPPF. Indeed, Ratby Village in my constituency, we have predatory developers like Lagan Homes who are taking advantage of the current situation, forging ahead with proposals to bulldoze over the boroughs, despite a staggering 900 households in that village writing to the Borough Council to oppose this ecological vandalism. And I'm sure Leicester City Council were jumping for joy at the news that they would have to build 31% fewer homes by 2030, but rural areas like mine and my residents would have to see additional housing as it's pushed further and further out. In truth, this reduction is why their decision to build houses on the edge of Glenfield leaves such a sour taste in the mouths of local residents, particularly in Glenfield and Blaby District. But what does it look like in the context? As I said, the City Council has been asked to produce fewer houses, whereas in rural areas like mine, such as in Blaby and Hinckley and Bosworth, they've been asked to dramatically increase by 69% and 59% respectively. Unfortunately, the planning reforms does not really take into account these cross-boundary implications. But what should we be doing instead? The government should instead be fostering a cooperative relationship, top-down. Our local authorities should be encouraged to work alongside one another in order to stop the situations that I've described happening. This can be done by allowing adjacent borough and district councils to actually have a say in housing and development policies through their various local plans, particularly where it will impact the neighbouring authority. But also there should be ability for residents in adjacent boroughs to view and comment on those plans of the adjacent local planning authority areas. Furthermore, the increased arbitrary housing targets for each borough council area simply do not take into consideration the impact that these adjacent targets will bring. There is surely a better method in developing sustainable housing county-wide rather than local authorities passing houses next to their own front lawn. Finally, and probably the most important under the current regime, there is no requirement and thought given to the financial compensation for local authorities that are adversely impacted. Section 106 agreements and community infrastructure levy contributions are paid by developers to local authorities to mitigate the impact of specific developments. They're well-intended negotiation agreements that do enforce developers to give something back to the community, whether that be funding for infrastructure, for improvements or for green spaces. However, they fall short in cross-boundary considerations, as we have seen in the examples I've given for Markfield and Glenfield. Charnwood Borough Council have made it explicitly clear that the Section 106 monies for the developments along the boundary of Hinckley and Bosworth would go to their borough. For example, how can spending or those allocations for development on the edge of Markfield, which would benefit Loughborough and Barrow, be in the interests of Markfield residents because they sit in a different borough? This undermines local buy-in to the planning process. Instead, there should be a more practical approach whereby Section 106 agreements go to the authority where the services are actually being used. Another anomaly of cross-boundary development is council tax precepts and the distribution thereof. The new residents in Markfield, for example, were paying into Charnwood Borough Council rather than their own Borough Council because of the boundary. So in conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, I am not a NIMBY. I called this debate to raise the issue posed when we have cross-boundary planning application. And I called it because I believe there should be a collaborative, holistic approach, as mentioned by some of my honourable friends here. And I would encourage the government to listen to this debate and consider bringing about changes to the proposals that I outline.
Josh Newbury.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to first start by congratulating the Honourable Member for Mid Leicestershire on securing this debate on this important but often overlooked issue. And having known him for many years before our new roles, I can say with authority that his constituents will be very well served in this House. In particular because his constituents, like mine, are represented in this House by one of their local councillors. And I too would like to draw attention to my declarations of interest, which include my ongoing unpaid role as a district councillor for my home village of Norton Keynes. As councillors, we know that the complications of cross-border developments can cause various issues, which I'm sure are seldom considered when developments are brought forward. We all know that council boundaries don't always reflect local communities. That's inevitable to some extent, boundaries going down the middle of main roads, for example. But it's not particularly logical or necessary to have housing estates or even individual homes divided between different council areas. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm a bit of a local government nerd, so I could give you many examples close by to where I live and across my region, but I'll spare you and focus on my constituency. So on the northeast edge of Cannock Chase, we have a small estate nonsensically split between Brereton and Ravenhill and Armitage with Hansacre, which is in the constituency of my honourable friend, the member for Lichfield. This is reflected in council boundaries as well, so there is clearly an impact on our local services. However, a far bigger cross-border development is fast approaching in the form of the redevelopment of the huge former Rugeley power station site. When it was a 1,000 megawatt power station, nobody particularly knew where the boundary was or minded where it was. My predecessor and the former member for Lichfield would often joke about which of the cooling towers were in each of their patches. But once 2,300 homes, around 900 of which will be in Cannock Chase, have been built, this could become a major issue. Rugeley already has several developments on its fringes which are outside of our boundary, the Hawksyard Estate and Haythorne Grove, for example. The vast majority of those new residents feel that they live in Rugeley and go into Rugeley for various services, yet their lower tier local authority council tax goes to Lichfield District Council. This means that any service which draws on district council resources is strained by an inconsistent council tax base. The same obviously is true of parish and town council services, of course. And it isn't just about services that residents go to, it's also about the services that come to them at home, bin collections, for example. And we also know that NHS commissioning decisions around SEND provision, for example, are sometimes done on a district-by-district basis. The issue of a chronic lack of general practice capacity in Rugeley and Brereton is going to be a major issue for the new power station development unless our integrated care board acts quickly. I also feel that there can sometimes be a democratic deficit as residents in those cross-border developments are split between different council areas and different parliamentary constituencies. We all know that knowing who to contact about various local issues can be challenging enough as it is, without estates being bisected by boundaries that make no sense. Sometimes these boundaries are tidied up through ward or constituency boundary reviews, but we know that the process of changing council boundaries can only happen at the request of both councils, and clearly there is no incentive for the council that benefits from council taxpayers who don't tend to use their services to consent to these principal area boundary reviews. As the Honourable Member for Mid Leicestershire said, they have all the benefits and none of the drawbacks. That process can also be cumbersome, so it rarely happens, even when a small move in a boundary could be a logical thing to do. Given that our constituency boundaries are often based on council boundaries, that issue often isn't corrected for Westminster elections either. Now, I don't come here, Madam Deputy Speaker, with any oven-ready solutions, although it does strike me that in other countries, Canada for example, local authorities can, with appropriate oversight, annex territory from others to prevent these cross-border challenges and inefficiencies from arising. I hope the government will consider how we can better address these challenges. Any solutions we can come to will certainly greatly benefit community identity and local services. Thank you.
Minister Matthew Pennycook.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Having not had the chance to do so personally, can I begin by welcoming the member for Mid Leicestershire to his place? I think it's fair to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the important issue of cross-boundary planning cooperation has received far too little attention in this place over recent years, and I therefore very much welcome the Honourable Gentleman giving the House an opportunity to consider it in some detail. I also appreciate the clarity with which he set out his position on the matter. He will know that the 8 Leicestershire authorities are at different stages of plan preparation, having delayed due to further work addressing Leicester City's unmet need. Due to the Secretary of State's quasi-judicial role in the planning system, I'm able to comment on the details of specific local plans or specific local applications, but the points he's made are on the record, and I'd expect him to make written representations to the Department in the appropriate way on some of these specific concerns he's raised. As the Honourable Gentleman knows, the 9 local authorities in Leicester and Leicestershire voluntarily came together to collaborate on the publication of a non-statutory strategic growth plan in 2018. That plan provides a high-level vision for the sub-region up to 2050, setting out its housing and economic development needs and focusing growth on key strategic areas. Key to securing cross-party political support for voluntary collaboration along these lines has been the commendable desire to address the negative impacts of ad hoc speculative development and to stimulate infrastructure investment to support growth. But equally vital, Madam Deputy Speaker, has been a shared understanding of the obvious functional geography of a sub-region with a city at its heart, strong pre-existing relationships at member and officer level, and clear governance structures that are independent of any one authority. While the partnership arrangements in place in Leicestershire took a not insignificant amount of time to establish, and to the best of my understanding nearly collapsed several times, they do aptly demonstrate that local planning authorities can and already do work together informally to deal with cross-boundary and cumulative matters. However, Leicestershire is a rare example, notwithstanding the concerns the Honourable Gentleman has raised, of a relatively successful cross-boundary example of cooperation in a planning system whose incentive structure is not geared towards facilitating it. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Government have inherited a planning system which, outside of London, some metro areas have spatial planning powers, while others only have the power to prepare non-statutory plans, and where a lack of effective levers, whether that be governance arrangements that require unanimity or the inability to set the strategic direction of where new affordable housing should be delivered, prevents those mayors that do have spatial planning powers from realising the full potential of those powers. In the rest of the country, there is the duty to cooperate. The Honourable Gentleman opposite mentioned that. This is a requirement which provides a minimum standard for cross-border strategic planning, but by common consensus has not proved to be an effective mechanism for fostering the kind of deep strategic cooperation that enables areas to meet their cross-border challenges and the sharing of unmet local need to adjacent authorities. And we have the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act 2023, which included provisions that enable local authorities to come together to produce joint spatial development strategies. But as the choice would be entirely discretionary and the current incentives for doing so are weak, there's no evidence that scores of areas eagerly await the opportunity to take this particular approach. The result, Madam Deputy Speaker, is a planning system that currently lacks any effective mechanisms for cross-boundary strategic planning. Now, this has not always been the case. Indeed, planning for housing growth and infrastructure at a larger than local scale has been integral to the functioning of England's planning system for most of the past half-century, whether that be through county structure plans, regional planning guidance, or the comprehensive system of regional strategic planning, including regional spatial strategies introduced by the last Labour government. The period since that architecture was abolished by the coalition government in 2011 has therefore been something of an aberration, with the duty to cooperate ostensibly facilitating necessary strategic cross-boundary planning, but in practice failing to do so in any meaningful way. The result has been large parts of England where no strategic planning activity takes place, a number of notable local plan failures, increased delays in local plan production, growing public antagonism towards the planning system, and a yawning gap between the amount of development that the country needs and what is actually being built. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Government is committed to bringing this suboptimal situation to an end by strengthening the existing NPPF policy requirements about effective cooperation requirement in the short term, and then to introduce effective new mechanisms for cross-boundary strategic planning through legislation, with a view to implementing a universal system of strategic planning in this Parliament. I want to make clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we're not intending to return to the pre-2011 regional planning system, but rather looking at how we can ensure effective cross-boundary cooperation of the kind that I take the Honourable Gentleman wants to see in Leicestershire is taking place at a sub-regional level. While it's still too early to be definitive about the precise model, the Government is attracted to the spatial development strategy, which is well established in London, with the London Plan having been produced and continually reviewed over a 20-year period by successive London mayors. Whatever the model ultimately selected, it's important to note, Madam Deputy Speaker, that strategic plans are not big local plans, nor should the forthcoming introduction of statutory strategic planning arrangements be taken by local or planning authorities as a reason not to progress the development of their local plans. Local plans are the best way for communities to shape future development in their areas. The Government is determined to progress toward our ambition of universal local plan coverage, and we intend to drive local plans to adoption as quickly as possible. In all areas, strategic sub-regional plans will guide development for the local planning authorities in the area, and local plans will need to be in general conformity with them. We will expect local plans to be updated or developed alongside the strategic planning process. And this process that we envisage, Madam Deputy Speaker, is where those large, larger than local level questions, negotiations about where large-scale housing growth will be determined. Given that the Honourable Gentleman's constituency spans 3 local authorities, I know he will take an active interest in the Government's plans in this area. Local authorities in Leicester and Leicestershire have shown what can be achieved through the voluntary production of a non-statutory strategic growth plan, and I note that they have been working effectively on their local plans, including various local authorities meeting unmet needs from Leicester City. However, the experience of the partnership arrangements in place in the county also highlights the risks and the limitations of voluntarism. I hope that the intention to require statutory strategic planning arrangements to be put in place across England will be welcomed by the authorities that lie within the boundaries of Mid Leicestershire constituency as a means of more quickly and effectively resolving cross-boundary and communicative issues of the kind the Honourable Gentleman has drawn attention to. And on that note, Madam Deputy Speaker, I look forward to further discussions with the Honourable Gentleman and other Honourable Members as the Government takes forward its plans in this area.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. The ayes have it. Order, order.